Okay, what I'm going to be covering today is really about the new ABCD staging classification and progression display. The first 10 or 15 minutes are going to be some background dealing with the bad display, because you need to understand the bad display to understand how we generated our thought process in doing the ABCD progression display. Okay, so most of you are familiar with the bad display. Again, there's always some confusion about what the real purpose of this is. So the bad display doesn't diagnose keratoconus. It's designed to separate normal from abnormal. So it is basically a rapid screening display for you to use in basically a refractive practice. Realize, yes, it's very sensitive to keratoconus, but it's not specific. In other words, if you had a cornea that was massively edematous, you would have a highly abnormal bad display because it's far from normal. So its goal is to separate normal from abnormal, okay? And the part of it you have to understand is what we call the enhanced reference surface. If I go back to the original display, this is the anterior and posterior cornea using a standard reference surface, which is a sphere, the best fit sphere taken from the central 8mm zone. The second maps over here use what's called an enhanced reference surface. So you can imagine if you had a shape like this that has a cone on it, and you fit a best fit sphere to that shape, this is what it would look like. And unfortunately, the pointer on this doesn't work on a LED screen. But you can see what we're looking for are what we call these positive islands of elevation. So we're looking for the area that sticks up, that represents the ectatic region. But if you look at this, you'll understand that the best fit sphere averages the entire area. So it averages what is more the normal cornea plus the ectatic region. What we really would like would be something that more follows what would be a normal cornea for the ectatic region to stick up more. And that would be that shape, okay? Because obviously the ectatic region sticks up more, is more visually obvious when you look at it. And how we do that is we take this same 8mm optical zone that we use for the regular best fit sphere, and we exclude an area surrounding the thinnest point. Now, the bad display software is actually a lot more complicated than this, because that exclusion zone in the bad software varies between 3 and 4 millimeters, and it's done based on a number of parameters, mostly being the cylinder or the amount of astigmatism in the cornea. But patients that have keratoconus almost always end up having a 3mm exclusion zone. But for simplifying, we usually just say it's a fixed area, but on the bad it's not. It's actually a very dynamic, and it's a rather complicated formula. But the point is, we take an area surrounding the thinnest point, and we remove that from the best fit sphere computation. When you do that, you effectively take this and change it to that. More importantly, and we'll show you examples of this, normal corneas don't have an ectatic region. So on a normal cornea, when you take that 8mm zone and take out that 3mm center on the thinnest, you don't have a significant change in that shape. And this is what happens. You can see this cornea here. There's a little area that's suspicious over here that looks like a very early island. And again, what all these are, that's the pupil. And then this dotted line is the 8mm optical zone that we take the data from. Here, you'll notice that that hard to see area becomes much more easy to define, because this is now the enhanced reference surface. And this is, again, that same 8mm zone, that's the pupil, but that's the exclusion zone. So we've taken this out to compute the reference surface, and it allows this area to be much more prominent. So basically the same thing that we showed you here. Here is another example again. regular reference surface. Most people wouldn't miss that, but you'll notice how much easier it is to see on the right. And on the posterior cornea, again, very easy to see, but notice it goes from plus 60 to plus 87. Again, when you use the enhanced reference surface, you have greater elevation difference. And particularly on very early cones, it becomes much easier to see. Just as important, as I said, is that we don't take normal eyes and make them look pathologic. And you can see here again, on the left is using the standard best fit sphere. On the right is the enhanced reference surface, and there's very little change. When we looked at that over a large population base, the change in going from the standard enhanced reference surface, the change from going from the standard 8mm best fit sphere to the enhanced reference surface was highly statistically significant to separate normal from keratoconic. And you can read the numbers here, but going from the standard 8mm best fit sphere to the enhanced reference surface, normalized averaged less than 2 microns of change. And keratoconic eyes on the anterior surface averaged roughly 20 microns of change. That had a p-value of 0.0001, so highly significant. And on the posterior surface, it's even more dramatic. Posterior normalized had changes less than 3 microns, while abnormal or keratoconic eyes had changes in the order of 40 microns. Again, highly statistically significant. And if we show that graphically, again, you can see the change going from the standard best fit to the enhanced reference surface clearly can separate normal eyes from keratoconic eyes. So again, you'll understand why I'm going over this before we get onto the ABCD. But again, the current bad version looks at 9 parameters in a regression analysis. Only 5 are shown on the bottom, but I'll show you later, but it actually uses 9 parameters to determine whether the eye is normal or abnormal. So these are what we call the D parameters. These are the ones on the bottom. It's the anterior elevation change, the posterior elevation change, the pachymetric progression, the thinnest point, the displacement of the thinnest point, and then there's additional ART max, anterior and posterior elevation at the thinnest point, and K max. The only reason we have K max in there is that people wanted it. It adds nothing to the regression analysis. It's actually a very poor performing parameter. There's also some confusion about when people see these color-coded. Each parameter individually is color-coded based on its deviation from normal. It will turn yellow at 1.6 standard deviations and will turn red at 2.6 standard deviations from the norm. It is not uncommon to see individual parameters in a normal eye that may be yellow or red, okay? The example I always give is glaucoma. If you have someone who has a pressure of 23, a cup to disc of 0.8, an abnormal visual field, and an abnormal nerve fiber layer, they're abnormal. If you have someone who has a cup to disc of 0.1, a normal visual field, an absolutely normal nerve fiber layer, but a pressure of 22, doesn't mean they're abnormal, even though the 22 would light up as a yellow parameter. Again, if it's 1.6 standard deviation, that means 5% of your population will have some value that's outside of that. So it's not, don't use these individual parameters. The final D is the one that has statistical significance to separate normal from abnormal. So don't overread the individual parameters. You do have the option in the software to actually remove the color coding from the individual parameters, but not from the final D. And that is because, and the reason why we did it, there are some people for medical legal reasons don't want to bring up in the chart a value that looks abnormal even though the final is completely within normal limits. So again, this is what it looks like. Again, this represents the anterior surface, the posterior surface. These are the 2 pachymetric progression. But you'll notice again that there's a lot more parameters that we report to you than just the ones that are on the bottom here.
Quick question. Our software is like this. It has DA, the Art Max, And you were showing, is the newer version?
No, this is the newer version.
Okay.
This is the newer version. Okay. So again, I say here, you may have individual yellow or red, and I specifically showed this here. Notice we have a red parameter, but the final reading is well within normal limits. Okay. Don't overread the individual parameters. You need to use other information. It is a screening display. You always have to look at age, ablation depth, family history. It's one bit of information. Yep. Okay. So my general guidelines, and I'm relatively conservative, I rarely do refractive surgery on patients under 21 unless they need it for occupational reasons. With absolutely no data, I do not do LASIK if the thinnest pachymetry is 495 or less. Nothing to back that up. That's just my practice. I always use the thinnest point for computations. So if I'm doing a residual bed or a PTA computation, I use the thinnest point, not an apical reading. I haven't used an ultrasound pachymeter in probably eight years. Just keeps moving on its own. Okay. Again, I use a minimal 300 residual bed on my computations. It's based on the thinnest pachymetry. I used to use, and I won't mention a company, I used to use a different femto that had more variability. So I would use my femto setting plus one standard deviation. The one that we switched to actually is very, very, very tight. We've tested it. So now I use it based on the actual setting of my femtosecond. So computed ablation depth, thinnest pachymetry, and my femtosecond later. I use that for both the PTA computation and for my residual bed. And these are my general, I want to stress the word general guidelines of how I use the bed. And as for patients in their 20s, less than 30, I use a final D of 1.6 or less, 30 to 35, 1.8, 35 to 42, over 40, 2.2, and patients over 55, I am probably much more liberal. These are LASIK. I'm also more liberal if we're doing surface ablation. General guidelines.
So just because you're thinking of more cross-linking as you get older?
Yeah, the cornea is more, naturally occurring. The cornea is more rigid as we get older. And the other reason is a risk analysis. You're more likely to have an undiagnosed keratoconic at the age of 20 than you are at the age of 50. So if you've gotten to 50 and you've been normal for 49 years, you're not likely to pick up an undiagnosed keratoconic. But also because, yes, the cornea becomes more rigid and the risk of ectasia is much lower as you get older.
And that's despite the curvature, there's any like asymmetry in the cornea?
Yes.
So you will still proceed with LASIK?
Well, asymmetry is one of the most over-diagnosed. Anyone with an angle kappa will have asymmetry, but will still have orthogonal principal meridians, which is why we don't show you curvature maps, because while they may be sensitive on the anterior, they're very non-specific. And anyone with an angle kappa will give you an abnormal or asymmetric, but still will have orthogonal principal meridians. So in summary, just for the bad again, it allows high specificity and sensitivity, again, to separate normal from abnormal. Additional testing, I've had not used a Placido device since 1989, just to let you know. But again, it's one bit of information. You need to look at age, ablation depth, family history, stability, and again, remember to compare eyes for symmetry. Highly asymmetric maps are also a warning sign. So that was just an introduction, and you'll understand now why I started with that, because it's important to understand the concept of that exclusion zone that we use in the bad display. So this is now about 1.5 years old, or closer to 2 years now, but there was an article in the journal Cornea, actually the 4 major cornea societies, the Cornea Society, Asia Cornea Society, Eucornea, and Pan Cornea. So that's South America, Asia, Europe, North and South America got together, and we did this consensus document on keratoconus. And one of the conclusions were that we don't have an adequate way of classifying staging, and we have no way to determine whether true progression occurs or not. From that, I began some work to try to answer those 2 questions. Can we have a better way to classify disease? And can we have a way to determine when a true progression occurs? And this has been the bane of my existence since fellowship, that we are the only field of medicine that uses a 70-year-old classification system. Can you imagine going to your oncologist and then saying, well, I'm staging you based on something from 1947? You would like walk out of the office. But I will tell you, you will still hear people at this meeting use Amsler-Krumeich. It is an absolutely useless classification for a number of reasons. First, it was based on optical pachymetry, which none of you have ever even seen, but probably, okay, and a keratometer. That's all it was based on. I know you have, right? Okay, yeah. Yeah, I know. Based on optical pachymetry and a keratometer. And it was developed when there were only two options: penetrating keratoplasty or contact lenses. Okay? So what are its weaknesses? And there's loads of them. I won't spend lots of time. But first, it relies on, it was based on optical pachymetry. It relied on an apical reading. And in this cornea here, the apical reading is 520. The cornea actually thins to 4999. So you need to be able to look at the whole cornea, not just a single ultrasound reading. And the biggest limitation is that it was done again in 1940s. It predates our ability to look at the posterior cornea. So in Amsler-Krumeich, this is a normal eye. This is anything but a normal eye. This is an eye with true disease. We call it subclinical keratoconus. It's not suspect or these other terms I don't like. It's true disease. But the anterior surface, which is a late finding in keratoconus, is still fairly normal. So the patient has good vision. They have a prominent posterior ectasia, an abnormal pachymetric progression, and I'm trying to read the number from here. I think it's about 4 standard deviations outside the norm. But in Amsler-Krumeich, this doesn't even register. Okay? The other limitation, I every so often participate in this group that meets in Europe. It's called the Expert Panel on Keratoconus. And for years, they keep discussing who's appropriate for rings. And they keep using Amsler-Krumeich, which is kind of ridiculous because it doesn't separate. I don't know if anyone, we don't do a lot of rings in the US, but you can have advanced disease in a normal anterior surface, which would be contraindicated for rings because they'll actually induce some aberration. But if you have early changes in the anterior surface, you may want to use rings. But Amsler-Krumeich makes no distinction in this. So if we look at these two patients here, there's an 18-year-old with a PAC of 410, a mean K of 52, and an RX of -8. We have another patient who's 47, the PAC of 544, a mean K of 48.5, and an RX of 525. Most of us would agree, not only would these likely require different treatments, but these two patients are highly different. They are stage 2 on Amsler-Krumeich. They're the same. So it's really a useless classification. So this is my view of Amsler-Krumeich. Kudu beings, I hate when people, they keep saying, this is how I treat stage 2 disease. And I gave you 2 examples that are distinctly different. To me, it's a useless classification. So this has been my thing from many years. We need to stop using it. We are really laughed out by the rest of medicine when they see us use a classification based in the 1940s. So what we need is no different than what other fields do. Again, I use oncology because it's a good example. If you were to go to an oncologist and had breast cancer, they stage your nodes, they stage the extension, they stage your genetic markers. Each thing is staged separately. We need to do that with keratoconus. We need full anatomical changes, both the anterior cornea, the posterior cornea, the corneal thickness. These need to be reasonably simple parameters so we can convey. It should be platform independent. In other words, it should be applicable across any device that's capable of tomographic data. So that could be Scheimpflug or OCT. And again, relatively easy to convey. The reason also is because now we have treatments other than just contacts and penetrating keratoplasty. Before, when we had just contacts and penetrating keratoplasty, all we really needed to know is when the anterior surface got so bad, that the patient couldn't wear contacts and needed a transplant. But now we have rings, we have cross-linking. This in particular is the important one, because there you want to identify and intervene as early as possible. Adult PK and RGP lenses. So, as I said, I started talking about the bad because I showed you that when we remove that center zone surrounding on the thinnest point, we effectively normalize the reference surface. We normalize the reference surface because removing that zone surrounding the thinnest point effectively removes the bulk of the cone. And I said also in the bad display, it's a dynamic number between 3 and 4 millimeters, but on patients with keratoconic, it's almost always goes to the 3 millimeter zone. So again, in the bad, we remove that, and again, it works because we're removing the bulk of the ectatic region. Well, instead of removing it to normalize it, we're going to look at that because that effectively describes or is the bulk of the ectatic region. So as again, I say here, as opposed to removing the exclusion zone, that's the area we're going to examine to grade our patients. And it's a 3 millimeter zone surrounding the thinnest point of the cornea. Excuse me. So we, again, use a fairly large database, and we also change from diopters to radius of curvature. And again, the machine will do this automatically, so radius of curvature sounds confusing because we're not used to it. Optometry is used to radius of curvature more with contact lenses. But the reason why we convert to radius of curvature is in diopters, the posterior cornea is a low power minus lens. And that's not intuitive to us. If I was to tell you the anterior surface is 55 diopters and the posterior surface is -7, you cannot make any comparison. So radius of curvature is independent of index of refraction and allows you direct comparisons. So this is just not important, but just what we did. We looked at a large population. We determined in radius of curvature from the 3 millimeter zone centered on the thinnest point what normal values would be in standard deviations across a large population. We then looked at Amsler-Krumeich just at their anterior surface. We took their grade 1, 2, 3, and 4, converted it to radius of curvature, and determined what the standard deviations would be for those breakdowns. We didn't follow it exactly, but that was kind of a starting point. And then we also added a stage 0, because if you think about it, Amsler-Krumeich doesn't recognize a normal eye. Everything is staged 1, 2, or 3, which we view as disease. So we came out with 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. We took those standard deviations that we used on the anterior surface and then applied it to the posterior surface and the corneal thickness. And then we also added a distance visual acuity. So ABCD stands for A, anterior surface, B, back or posterior surface, C is corneal thickness, and D is distance visual acuity. And again, the A is a 3 millimeter zone surrounding the thinnest point. The B is the posterior radius of curvature of a 3 millimeter zone surrounding the thinnest point. C is corneal thickness, the minimal corneal thickness reading, and D is distance visual acuity. One of the other reasons that we chose a 3 millimeter zone is, don't know if many of you know, but Scheimpflug's, whatever Scheimpflug device, has much better coverage of the cornea than an OCT device. OCTs have more limited coverage. By using a 3 millimeter zone surrounding the thinnest point, it should be reasonably platform independent if other companies want to do it, because we're using a relatively small area. Okay. And right now, this is part of what's called the Topo Metric Keratoconus staging. So again, I know it sounds confusing going radius, but it's done automatically by the machine. And I'll show you more and blow up what it does. So this is the classification, but this is the actual description. Okay, so again, you realize even in Amsler-Krumeich, you could have 50 diopters and 54 diopters, and obviously that's not a small change, but that can be in the same classification. So for studies, if you want to put people in classifications, this is the classification, but this is the actual description. So this cornea is 7.6 millimeters. That's the radius of curvature, that 3 millimeter zone. The posterior is 4.82. The thinnest pachymetry, 381. and visual acuity is 20/20. We then show you graphically how those relate, and then give you the classification here. So if someone was to tell me this is A0, B4, C3, D0, I would know A0, it has a normal anterior surface, a very prominent posterior ectasia, the cornea is moderately thinned, but distance visual acuity is normal because the anterior surface is normal. So it allows us, again, to describe each separate layer. And let's look at some examples. So this is the normal 4-map refractive. That's the Topo Metric Keratoconus staging. This is that section blown up. And here you can see it's a very normal eye. So we have zeros right across the board. This is now very early ectatic change. You see the A's 1.2, and you'll see again A1, B0, C0, D1, mild decrease in vision because we have some mild changes on the anterior surface.
So this one shows that the anterior and the vision is going, which is some of those later lines, but the posterior is normal.
Well, the posterior is normal within the staging range. It's not normal. That's different. Don't confuse. That's the back elevation. It doesn't reach the next. That's why, as I said, this is really this accurately describes. This is just putting you in a classification.
Right.
Yes, and this is literally right on the edge. That's correct.
So is the BAD
What is the BAD?
high or normal in this?
That would be abnormal. I don't have that on here.
It would show up with a red box on the final D.
It may be a yellow box.
Yellow box.
I would have to look, yeah, but I would have to look at it.
Like one where it's like it's a
No, but that would show up as abnormal, yeah. And this is moderately advanced disease. Again, you can see here, and then this is markedly advanced disease. So again, the actual parameters, the classification, and then exactly where you would fall graphically. So, okay. That was really stage one of what we were doing, but what the real goal was to try to come up with a way to determine when and if true progression occurs. Because right now, you can list probably 20 different parameters people are using for cross-linking to determine when to treat. Kmax is the most useful, but right off the bat, to have an abnormal Kmax means you have an abnormal anterior surface and you've already lost vision. So our goal was to try to come up with a way to determine when and if a true disease exists and is it progressive or not. So while we've had noise measurements on a lot of the parameters, the AB parameters are new parameters. So again, it's a 3 millimeter zone at the thinnest point on both the anterior and posterior surface, and that's a new parameter. So we need to be able to identify ectatic disease earlier, which is what really the bad display is for, and need a better way to classify disease severity. But the big thing is we need to know when and if progression occurs. So again, we've already showed you what the ABCD is, and what we needed to then do is determine the background noise of the measurement. So in other words, I think you all understand that if you get on a scale and you weigh 180 and you get on the scale again, you weigh 182 and wear it again at 179, there's a noise of 3. So if you get on you 185, you've gained weight. So we needed to know what the noise measurements were of each parameter. Additionally, we decided we needed to do that with 2 distinct populations, and I'll explain why. We needed to do it in a normal population base and a keratoconic population base. And the reason for that is that if you had a young patient with very early disease, those measurements more likely mimic a normal population with minor changes. If you have someone with advanced keratoconus, the noise levels are much higher on abnormal corneas. So we wanted to give you 2 different databases to choose from. A normal database for those with very early disease or those patients at higher risk, someone very young, and a keratoconic database for the patient that may be older with more established disease. Can I have the water bottle that's on that? Thank you. And again, we looked at 252 keratoconics and 135 normals on repetitive measurements. So the normal patients were easier to bring back. So they had 3 measurements by 3 different technicians on 3 different days, so like 27 measurements on each patient. The keratoconic patients were measured on the same day three times. And we determined what's called a one-sided confidence interval. So the one-sided confidence interval, because we're only interested in if the cornea thins or if it steepens. So we're looking at the noise levels on what's called the one-sided confidence interval, and we determined 2 confidence levels, an 80% confidence interval and a 95% confidence interval. Does that make sense, people? So, and what you will see is what you would anticipate. If you look at just, let's just say the anterior surface, the noise levels on green is the normal population, red is the keratoconic population. The noise levels are much less on the normal population. It's what you would expect. So you see that the keratoconic is much noisier. This is, again, noisier than that, and this is noisier than that. Okay? So again, the reason we did that is, again, to allow you to choose your risk assessment. Do you want to compare your patient to a normal population or a keratoconic? That would be based basically on the age of the patient and the degree of ectatic change that you see. And then this is what the display looks like. It will display up to 8 exams over time. Okay, it displays, this is the A, the anterior surface, B is the back, C is the corneal thickness, D is distance visual acuity. Then it shows you the confidence intervals. So the green are the normal, the red is the keratoconic, the dashed line is the 80% confidence interval, the solid is the 95% confidence interval. So let's say in this patient, you can see from exam 1 to exam 2, they had a change that was highly statistically significant, greater than 95% confidence interval on any of the populations. Okay. Same thing over here, it reached an 80% confidence interval. Here it's well above. So this patient was cross-linked, and you can actually mark in time when the patient was cross-linked, and it will show up as a hatched line. And then you can see again the response to cross-linking. To the right of it, not graphically, we also list almost every parameter people have ever used for progression, just in case you want to follow them. So again, it's age, this is the A, B, C, D, distance visual acuity, the final D, progression, ART max, K max, the 2 different Q values, and then a bunch of anterior parameters. So again, you can utilize it. And here again, we have the A, B, C, D classification. I do want to show you one thing, which I don't know if I can show it to you on this. The A, B, C, D classification goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. But on this, when we actually show you the C values, you will, if it's very severe, you can be above 4. The staging stops at 4, so you'll notice this number here is 4.2. It's still only going to be a 4. But on very advanced disease, so we allow these numbers to be more reflective of the actual rates of curvature, though in classification it's limited to those 4 stages. Okay, and I'll give you 2 examples. The last example is actually, I think, the most interesting. But this was published last month in Cornea. We published 5 eyes of tomographically proven unilateral keratoconus, if you want to call it unilateral ectasia, it doesn't really matter to me, over a minimum of, I think it was a 3.5 year up to a 7-year period. And here you can see this eye with the obvious keratoconus had huge amount of change. And again, you can know the classification. Again, you can see here it's above, but here absolute stability, and this is over a 4-year period. And this is maybe the same eye, but again, a completely normal right eye, markedly advanced left eye. And again, this is not as clear, so I can't tell. I think this is a 4 to 5 year period, but complete stability, and we have 5 cases of documented absolute stability, normalized, while the other eye has obvious keratoconus. But this, I think, is the most informative example of the utilization of the display. So this is a patient whose other eye was cross-linked. They had asymmetric keratoconus. Okay, so the other eye was cross-linked. Both the patient and the physician decided, since this eye was completely asymptomatic, okay, with normal vision, you can actually see the vision was 20/15, that they would just observe this patient. And this was before the progression display was available. And he had a number of exams over time, but in 2017, which is was about 3.5 years after the first exam, vision dropped to 20/25, and patient noticed a change. Patient came in and was cross-linked and was stabilized at a vision of 20/25. So did well with the cross-linking, but vision was 2 lines lost. Retrospectively, because you can look at this retrospectively, we put that patient in this display, and notice, by the second exam date, this person had statistically, still asymptomatic, but had statistically significant change in both the anterior, posterior, and at the 80% confidence interval on corneal thickness. That would have been the indication to treat. And hopefully you would have treated and not had a 2-line loss of vision. So again, this is a patient, we know the other eye had keratoconus. In the US, and not everyone's from the US, in the US the cost of cross-linking is insane at the moment. So rightfully so, the patient was reluctant on a quote, asymptomatic eye. But had this been done, clearly you could have shown the patient, your eye is changing, we need to intervene at this point. So that's what I really think is a good utilization of the display. So again, what's new? Good timing. Again, it's a topographic-based classification that recognizes all the anatomical layers. And again, it's a topographic-based progression display that will document when you have statistically significant change, and also will show you cross-linking efficacy. And again, the goal is to allow the surgeon and the surgeon to decide what risk we're giving you, again, both in 80 and 95, and which population is most appropriate. So again, if you had a 14-year-old, I would use the normal. If I had a 14-year-old, I probably wouldn't maybe even wait for progression if you truly have disease. But on your younger populations with very early disease, my suggestion is to compare to the normal population. But your more established cones, you probably should wait until you have statistical change based on the keratoconic lines. And I believe that's my last slide.